They're in for up to 10 minutes each.
Without objection.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, I rise today to ask a unanimous consent request on S-650. This is a bill that I've introduced with Senator Hirono that would extend the Federal Communication Commission's spectrum auction authority until the end of the fiscal year, September 30th of 2023. Currently, this authority is set to expire tomorrow night. Our legislation would prevent this expiration and allow the Department of Defense and the National Telecommunications and Information Administration to focus on a statutorily required study, which is to be completed by September of this year. This will define DoD's spectrum requirements and articulate the risks should the department lose access to portions of the 3.1 to 3.45 gigahertz frequencies that are home to systems that are used to defend our country from attack. The extension of this authorization until September 30th will allow time for the DoD and the NTIA to complete their study, which, as I say, is expected in September. We cannot allow potential authorizing spectrum legislation to affect any decision making related to the lower 3 gigahertz band before the DoD and the NTIA release their study, which is expected, as I say, in September. Madam President, the FCC's Spectrum Auction Authority was previously extended less than just 3 months ago. Unfortunately, each time this auction authority expires at short and arbitrary intervals, we find additional language being proposed that would modify the current process by which any sharing of this spectrum would be determined. The Department of Defense finds itself responding to proposals that include offering up for auction critical bands of spectrum before this study has been completed. The Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act of 2021 requires the Department of Defense to conclude the spectrum study by September 2023. Importantly, the study mandates examination of the feasibility of DoD sharing the 3.1 to 3.45 gigahertz band of spectrum, which is a very limited resource, with the industry. The extension which I call up today would make certain that the analysis of the study is completed before taking actions or before actions could be taken which may potentially harm the national security of the United States. Now, while the development of 5G networks is important to both the economic prosperity and national security of the United States, the premature auction of spectrum must not jeopardize the systems that depend on radars and other critical sensors to protect our troops and our citizens from air or missile attacks. Madam President, many of the reasons that make an extension until the end of the fiscal year vital simply can't be discussed here on the Senate floor because they need to be taken in a classified setting. Over the past several months, I've hosted a series of classified and unclassified briefings for my colleagues, their congressional staff members, the telecom industry, and the defense industry. These briefings were delivered by both the Department of Defense and the NTIA. Madam President, I think we all want to see the FCC's spectrum auction authority extended, and I am offering a solution that extends that auction authority and protects the national security of our country. I would hope that the industry and those who support the continuation of 5G would agree that an extension until the end of the year would be very appropriate. And with that, Madam President, I ask a unanimous consent that the Committee on Commerce, Science, and Transportation be discharged from further consideration of S-650 and the Senate proceed to its immediate consideration. Further, that the bill be considered read a third time and passed, and that the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
Is there objection?
Madam President, I object.
Senator from Vermont.
Thank you. Reserving the right to object. Madam President, the senator is working very diligently to achieve a goal that all of us share. And the basic question right now is going to be whether to have a 60-day extension that has been agreed to by the House, or to have an extension, as the Senator is proposing, until the end of the fiscal year. Bottom line, it's the judgment of many that sticking with the 60-day extension is beneficial to achieve the goal of having the parties that are now negotiating come to a longer-term resolution even beyond the end of the fiscal year. We've got to extend, ultimately, the spectrum authority beyond 60 days or beyond the end of the fiscal year. We really have to extend it for a much greater period of time in order to achieve the goals that are shared between all of us. The Senator Rounds' bill, of course, as I mentioned, would extend things until September 30. We think that's going to take pressure off negotiators, and we have some confidence that if we keep that 60-day provision or that 60-day status, they're going to get to that long-term goal. Further, the House has made it clear that they're not going to take up any bill that moves the date to September 30. So that's just a reality that we have to deal with. Others may agree with Senator Rounds to push it to September 30, but the best information we have is that the other body has no intention of taking up that bill. If that were the case, we pass a bill extending to September 30, the House doesn't take it up, then the Spectrum Authority expires, and that's bad for everybody. So it sends the wrong signal, obviously, as well to our allies and our competitors. We just can't afford to risk a lapse of authority. And given the reality of the time constraints we're under, even if the House were, pardon me, the Senate were to pass Senator Rounds' bill, we'd have a situation where it's rejected by the House, that's our best judgment, and there would be a lapse in authority, which would be very threatening to the well-being of all of us concerned. So on that basis, I offer this objection to the unanimous consent request of my colleague from North Dakota.
The objection is heard.
Thank you, Madam President. I'd like to thank my colleague from Vermont for his comments. I think we all want the same thing. We want the auction authority to be able to move forward. I do believe that it is very appropriate because there are negotiations which are ongoing, but none of them can be completed until the report, the study, is completed on September 30th. If we did a short-term extension, we simply are back in here again, but once again, the Department of Defense finds itself in a position to where once again they are being asked to modify the appeals process in this existing statute, which we already have on the books. And we find ourselves under, as the senator from Vermont indicates, a very serious time constraint to try to get this done within 60 days. My question is if 60 days is good enough, wouldn't it be better to go until the end of the year when we actually have the data available to make a good decision about whether or not there is the availability of additional spectrum for a sharing or a sale that could be used perhaps for 5G, but at the same time, we could be assured would not impact our national defense priorities. And with that, Madam President, I thank you. I thank my colleague from Vermont, and I yield the floor.
Madam President.
The senator from Vermont.
Madam President, I rise today to ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to consideration of H.R. 1108 to extend the Federal Communication Commission's authority to auction spectrum. Congress has never let the FCC spectrum auction authority lapse before. We can't do it now. As I noted in my earlier comments, spectrum is critical to our modern communication system, something that actually Senator Rounds, you've spoken so eloquently to. So we've got to keep it going. We need an FCC and an NTIA that respect all federal incumbent uses of spectrum, especially those uses that protect our national security. Again, I acknowledge the comments of Senator Rounds. As we consider the reauthorization of the FCC's auction authority, it's important to recognize we're entering a really new era in the United States spectrum strategy. That new strategy has to be comprehensive to ensure our remaining spectrum is put to its highest and best use. And we must ensure we don't impact or interfere with our national security as we try to get further benefits in the civilian sector for spectrum utilization. H.R. 1108's 2 months extension would allow for further development of this comprehensive approach. And as I mentioned earlier, folks are really working on that, and we don't want to take the pressure off. We want to keep the pedal to the metal, see if they can reach an agreement. Importantly, H.R. 1108's 2 months extension does not slow down or otherwise limit the Department of Defense's study of the lower 3 gigahertz band under the bipartisan infrastructure law. I just want to reiterate that. The DoD can continue with its study. It will remain on track to complete its study by September 30. The extension also doesn't change the requirement that any reallocation decisions for the band must wait until after the DoD finishes its study. So there's consensus here that we've got to make certain that DoD national security equities are front and center. What this extension would do is ensure that the critical work of our agencies in wireless ecosystem does continue uninterrupted. Maintaining the FCC's auction authority will allow Congress to work quickly toward developing forward-thinking spectrum policy that both protects our national security and encourages the development of new technologies. It's very important, especially now that time is of the essence for us to develop our own spectrum strategy and stay ahead of our competitors. So every month that we stall on a comprehensive spectrum bill is more time for our rivals to get ahead of us. For all of those reasons, I'm asking my colleagues to support H.R. 1108's 2 months extension of the FCC auction authority as my colleagues and I work towards a comprehensive spectrum legislation package to ensure that the United States continues to lead in spectrum innovation and policy. Madam President, I yield back. What? What do I have to do?
Read this.
Okay. And I'm sorry, I ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to the immediate consideration of H.R. 1108, which was received from the House and is at the desk. Further, that the bill be considered read a third time and passed, and that the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
Is there objection?
Madam President,
The senator from South Dakota.
reserving the right to object. I appreciate my friend and colleague from Vermont and his offer. My concern is that the spectrum study, which the senator has acknowledged, will not be done until September 30th. There is no reasonable explanation as to why we would not be able to extend until September 30th the auction capabilities that are available at the present time. However, there is an appeals process which is very important to the Department of Defense. And every time we have a discussion about the process moving forward, the risk of an appeals process modifying or being changed is incorporated, or at least is being proposed. For those of us that are very concerned about the ability to protect the very clear and important portions of the spectrum that the Department of Defense utilizes, it is important that there be no modifications to any appeals process between now and September 30th. Until such time as we have that available to us, it is simply not appropriate, I believe, to allow for an existing modification or new legislation to be proposed that does not take that into account. And so, because of that, once again, I don't want to see this lapse either. I would love to see it moved on, but I cannot think of a reason why we would not be able to extend the existing auction capabilities of the FCC, the NTIA, and so forth, and still protect the spectrum capabilities of the Department of Defense until September 30th, at which time the complete report is available. But until such time, I believe that it would be inappropriate to once again have the risk of modifications to any appeals process and any additional legislation that might be included in a further extension. Therefore, with all due respect, I must object.
Objection is heard. The senator from Vermont.
Just a remark. Here's the dilemma we have. Much of what the senator from South Dakota is saying, I agree with. But we've got two things that are relevant on a very practical level. One is the pressure that continues to be brought to bear on the negotiators with the 60-day extension to get a final agreement, which would solve the problems that all of us face and are a concern to the senator from South Dakota. The second one is a political one. It's been conveyed to us very clearly that the House will not take up anything beyond a 60-day extension. We may think they're wrong, but they have the authority to reject an extension beyond the 60 days. That would result in a lapse in spectrum authority, which would be devastating to all of us and all of the goals we are striving to achieve. So that's the practical question that we face. I yield back.